about Thomas Jefferson and the election of 1800. So the election would take place on December 3rd, the date of which the Electoral College would meet to vote on the next president of the United States. Jefferson was one of 4 presidential candidates. Though he hated leaving his hilltop plantation and believed that getting the presidency would make him a constant butt for every shaft of calamity which malice and falsehood could form, he nevertheless sought office with sincere zeal. So the 4 people running in that presidential election was, of course, Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr, another Democratic Republican, John Adams, a Federalist, as well as Charles Pinckney, another Federalist. Of course, in those days, there was not a separate ballot for president and vice president, so each party would nominate 2 from their party to run for office. So Thomas Jefferson had been troubled by John Adams' presidency and was convinced that the Radical Federalist Party was waging war against the spirit of the 76, or the spirit of the revolution. Jefferson had previously characterized the Federalist rule as a reign of witches, insisting that the party was adverse to liberty and calculated to undermine and demolish the Republic. If the Federalists prevailed, Jefferson believed that they would destroy the states and create a strong national government, every bit as oppressive as that of Great Britain. So the Revolution of 1776, Jefferson would later say, had determined the form of American government, and he believed the election of 1800 would decide its principles. Federalists and Republicans appeared to agree on only one thing. The victor of the 1800 election would set Americans' course for generations to come, perhaps even forever. Only a quarter of a century after signing the Declaration of Independence, the first election of the new 19th century was carried out in an era of intensely emotional partisanship among the people deeply divided over the scope of the American authority. Jeffersonian Republicans, on the other hand, insisted that the radical conservatives wanted to turn back the clock and reinstituting much of British colonial templates, including taxation, levies of fines, as well as army in time of peace. One of the things that Jefferson strongly opposed was the ultras, or the extreme federalists, who wanted to go to war with France. So the reason that these ultras, or extreme federalists, wanted to go to war was because the French had been sinking American commercial vessels en route to Great Britain, and they wanted to strengthen ties with Great Britain, enacting the Alien and Sedition Acts, which provided jail terms and fines for anyone who uttered or published any false, scandalous, or malicious statements against the United States government or its officials. While the Federalists defended the Sedition Acts as a necessity in the midst of a grave national crisis, Jefferson and his followers saw it as a means to silence Republicans. Jefferson had felt that the Federalists had extremely overreached themselves, and in the 1800 elections, he sought to kind of remove some of the Federalist power. The election of 1800 was conducted through a congressional meeting of 138 members of the Electoral College. They would cast 2 votes for president, which allowed electors to cast 1 vote for their favorite candidate and a second for a candidate who stood a chance of winning. Oftentimes, this would be the 2 Democratic Republican candidates or the 2 Federalist candidates. So the Constitution stipulated that if a candidate tied or none received a majority of electoral votes, the House of Representatives shall choose by ballot one of them for president. The Democratic-Republican Party had chosen Jefferson to be the main president and Aaron Burr as the candidate. Some of those personal attacks came directly from Jefferson to Adams for his role in the treatment of France, as well as kind of the ties with the Great Britain and the Federalist agenda to create a standing army in the time of peace. So Adams was portrayed by Jefferson as a monarchist who had turned his back on the Republic and he was called senile, a poor judge of character, vain, jealous, driven by an uncontrollable temper. Jefferson was not above being attacked by the Federalist Party either. He was labeled as a coward, saying that he lived in a luxurious home after others had sacrificed during the War of Independence. But he had fled like a jackrabbit when the British soldiers had raided Charlevoix in 1781, and he had failed miserably as Virginia's governor, demonstrating that his nerves are too weak to bear anxiety and difficulty. Federalists further insisted Jefferson had transformed into a dangerous radical during his residence in France, and a howled atheist. In the 1800 election, the greatest surprise among the contestants occurred in New York, a large coastal state that had given 12 of its electoral votes to Adams in 1796, allowing him to beat Jefferson. So in the 1800 election, the battle of supremacy in New York legislature had hinged on the outcome of New York City, thanks largely to the lopsided wins of the two working class wards, which many voters owned no property. The Republicans had secured all 24 of New York's electoral votes for Jefferson and Burr. This was essentially kind of the nail in the coffin, but Adams had refused to give up. After all of New England, which accounted for nearly half the electoral votes needed for the majority, was solidly in his favor. Adams felt certain that he would win some other votes elsewhere. At first, both parties thought they had a shot at carrying the states. With South Carolina's legislature was elected in mid-October, the final tally revealed that the assembly was about evenly divided between Federalists and Republicans, though unaffiliated representatives, all pro-Jefferson, would determine the outcome. Adams' hope was fading fast, but Jefferson, on the other hand, felt that his victory would be nearly certain. But instead, Jefferson and Burr had received 73 electoral votes, and Adams had just gotten 65 and Pinckney 64. The House of Representatives would have to make the final decision between the two Republicans. Adams thus became the first presidential candidate to fall victim to the notorious clause in the Constitution that counted each slave as 3/5 of an individual in calculating population and used to allocate both House seats and electoral votes. Had slaves who had no vote not been counted, Adams would have edged Jefferson by a vote of 63 to 61. In addition, the Federalists fell victim to the public's perception of what the Republicans stood for. The Democratic and the Federalists were seen as imperialists or authoritarians. In the House, each state would cast a single vote. If each of the 16 states voted that is, if not abstaining, 9 states would elect the president. Republican controlled 8 delegations: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And the Federalists held the other 6. Both Maryland and Vermont were deadlocked between the two candidates. But because Thomas Jefferson and Burr had tied in the Electoral College, public opinion appeared to be on the side of Jefferson. Not only had he been the choice of the party's nominating caucus, but he had served longer at the national level than Burr, and in more exalted capacity. But if neither man was selected by noon on March 4th, when Adams' term ended, the country would be without a chief executive until the newly elected Congress convened in December, 9 months later. In the interim, the current Federalist-dominated Congress would be in control. Faced with such a prospect, Jefferson wrote to Burr in December. His message was cryptic, but it had appeared to suggest that if Burr accepted the vice presidency, he would be given greater responsibility than previous vice presidents. Burr responded to Jefferson was reassuring. He pledged to disclaim all competition and he would speak on behalf of Jefferson's administration. So in the end, Federalists decided to back Burr. Hearing of their decision, however, Jefferson told Adams that any attempt to defeat the presidential election would proceed with resistance by force and incalculable consequences. Burr, who had seemed to disavow a fight for the highest office, now let it be known that he would accept the presidency if the city of Washington awoke to a crippling snowstorm on Wednesday, February 11th, the day the House was to begin voting. Nevertheless, one of the 105 House members did not make it to Congress, and his absence would not change the delegation's tally. Voting began the moment the House was gavelled into session. When the roll call was complete, Jefferson had carried 8 states, Burr 6, and the 2 deadlocked states had cast uncommitted ballots. Jefferson still needed one more vote for a majority. A second vote was held with a similar tally, then a third, when at 3 a.m., exhausted, congressmen finally called it a day. 19 roll calls had been taken, all with the same inconclusive results. By Saturday evening, 3 days later, the House had cast 33 ballots. The deadlock seemed unbreakable. For weeks, warnings had circulated of drastic consequences if Republicans were denied the presidency. Now the danger seemed palpable. A shaken President Adams was certain that the two sides had come to perceive a disaster and that the Civil War was expected. There was talk that Virginia would secede if Jefferson was not elected. Some Republicans declared that they would convene another constitutional convention to restructure the federal government so that it reflected the democratic spirit of America. It was rumored that a mob had stormed the arsenal in Philadelphia and was preparing to march on Washington to drive the defeated Federalists from power. Jefferson said that he could not restrain those of his supporters who threatened a dissolution of the Union. He told Adams that many Republicans were preparing to use force to prevent the Federalist legislative usurper of the executive branch. In all likelihood, it was these threats that ultimately broke the deadlock. The shift occurred sometime after Saturday's final ballots. It was Delaware's Bayard who blinked. That night, he sought out a Republican close to Jefferson, almost certainly John Nicholas, a member of the Virginia House of Delegates. Were Delaware to abstain, Bayard pointed out, only 15 states would ballot. With 8 states already in his column, Jefferson would have a majority and an exclusive victory at last. But in return, Bayard asked would Jefferson accept the terms that the Federalists had earlier pro-offered. Nicholas responded, according to Bayard's later reconciliation, that these conditions were very reasonable and that he could vouch for Jefferson's acceptance. The Federalist caucused behind closed doors on Sunday afternoon, February 15th, when Bayard's decision to abstain was announced. It touched off a firestorm. Cries of traitor, traitor rang out upon him. Bayard himself later wrote that the clamor was prodigious, the response was very overwhelming, and that many other old colleagues were furious with him. 2 matters in particular rolled his comrades. Some were angry that Bayard had broken ranks before it was known what kind of deal, if any, Burr might have been willing to cut. Others were upset that nothing had been heard from Jefferson himself. During a second Federalist caucus that afternoon, Bayard agreed to take no action until Burr's answer was known. In addition, the caucus directed Bayard to ask absolutely assurance that Jefferson would go along with the deal. Earlier the next morning, Monday, February 16th, according to Bayard's later testament, Jefferson made it known through a third party that the terms demanded by the Federalists, corresponding with his views and intentions, and we might confide in him accordingly. The bargain was struck, at least to Bayard's satisfaction, unless Burr offered him better terms. Jefferson would be the 3rd President of the United States. At some point Monday afternoon, Burr's letter arrives. What exactly he said or did not say in them, they likely were destroyed soon after they reached Washington, and their contents remain a mystery. Disappointed, disappointed, disappointing his Federalist proponents. Bayard, a letter written on Monday, told the Friends that Burr had acted a miserable pop. But Burr, at least according to Bayard's interpretations and reasons, that remained unknown to history, had refused to accept the accommodations with the Federalists. The same Monday evening, a dejected Theodore Sedgwick, Speaker of the House and a passionate Jefferson hater, notified friends at home the gig's up. The following day, February 17th, the House gathered at noon to cast its 36th and, as it turned out, final vote. Bayard was true to his word. Delaware abstained, ending 7 days of convening and the long electoral battle. The final mystery of the election of 1800 is whether Jefferson and his backers would have committed violence had he been denied the presidency. Soon after taking office, Jefferson claimed that there was no idea of using force. His remark proved little, yet during the ongoing battle in the House, he alternatively spoke of ascending to the Federalist misconduct in the hope that the behavior would ruin them, or of calling a second constitutional convention. He probably would have chosen one or both of these courses before risking bloodshed at the end of the Union. In the days that followed the House battle, Jefferson wrote letters to several surviving signers of the Declaration of Independence to explain what he believed his election had meant. It guaranteed the triumph of the American Revolution, he said, ensuring the realization of the new chapter of history of man that had been promised by Thomas Paine in 1776. In the years that followed, his thoughts often returned to the election's significance.